In April 2026, over just 5 days, 8 separate Bigfoot encounters were reported across Ohio. These sightings defied logic and everything we thought we knew about cryptids. But that's not all. The 8th and final encounter didn't just add to the count, it exposed a horrific reason to these surge. I'm Trevor, and this is Bigfoot Encounters. Marcus Tilley reported the first sighting. He has been driving long-haul routes through southern Ohio for 11 years. It was just after 3 a.m. when Bigfoot stepped out of the tree line and onto Route 56. He had time to yank the wheel hard, the trailer fishtailing behind him as his tires screamed across the center line. The Sasquatch he saw didn't run. Instead, it moved across the road in a long, fluid stride, like something that had been walking that road since long before Marcus was born. Unhurried, weightless, impossibly smooth for something that stood, by his estimate, at least 9 feet tall. The whole thing was wrong in a way he couldn't name. He pulled the truck to the shoulder and sat there with the engine running and the hazard lights strobing red across the tree line. Nothing moved. He waited 4 minutes, he checked his phone twice, before he got out. He walked to the center of the road where Bigfoot had been standing and stopped. And when I read what he reportedly saw, I felt goosebumps. The asphalt was rippling. Not cracked, not buckled. Rippling, the way blacktop looks on a highway in July when the temperature hits triple digits. He knelt down and put his palm flat against it. The surface was warm enough that he pulled his hand back. In 39-degree air, the road beneath where Bigfoot had stood was radiating heat, like a cast-iron skillet pulled off a stove. For that road to be warm enough to feel through a work glove in near-freezing air, something had to have transferred an enormous amount of thermal energy into the surface in the seconds Bigfoot crossed it. That's not a footprint, that's a thermal event. His dashcam footage covers the 12 seconds before and after impact. What it recorded was not footage of Bigfoot. It was 12 seconds of white static and a low-frequency hum. When the image returned, the road was empty, and Marcus was already pulling back onto the shoulder. If you think a melting road is the strangest thing that happened in Ohio that Monday, wait until you hear what a hunting dog found hiding in a tunnel 6 miles away. Ray Dunlap has owned coonhounds his entire adult life. His best dog, a 7-year-old red and tan male named Copper, had never once refused a command, not once in 7 years. And the night Bigfoot came through Vinton County, Copper didn't just disobey Ray Dunlap. Copper ran from something so horrific that he chose a haunted tunnel over the open dark. Moonville Tunnel is a railroad tunnel cut through a sandstone ridge in the mid-1800s, sealed now, surrounded by forest. Ray didn't care about any of that. He'd walked past Moonville Tunnel 100 times on hunting trips and never thought twice about it. That Monday morning, somewhere around 4 a.m., Copper's GPS collar showed the dog moving northeast from the area near Route 56 at a full sprint. Not a tracking pace, a fleeing pace. Ray followed on his phone's map, moving through the tree line with a flashlight, calling the dog's name, getting nothing back. The line ended at the entrance of Moonville Tunnel and went still. Ray found Copper pressed against the back wall of the tunnel, 40 yards in from the entrance, in the absolute dark. The dog was shaking, a full-body shudder, continuous, like something inside the dog was vibrating. Copper's eyes were open and fixed on the tunnel entrance. He would not look at Ray. He would not move toward Ray's voice. Ray had to physically carry him out, all 62 pounds of him, and Copper did not stop shaking for 2 hours. Whatever Copper had encountered, Bigfoot had been close enough to leave a mark. Ray found the footprint at the tunnel's entrance, just outside the threshold where the sandstone floor meets the dirt path. 18 inches long. He measured it against his boot, and then again with a tape measure he carries in his vest, with a width at the ball of the foot that he put at 8 inches. The depth of the impression in the soft ground suggested a weight that Ray, who has spent decades reading animal sign, estimated at somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds. But it wasn't the size that made him take a photograph and send it to his cousin before he'd even gotten Copper back to the truck. It was the toes. The toes were webbed, fully webbed, the way a beaver's hind foot is webbed, with the membrane pressing clear impressions between each digit in the mud. Ray has found bear tracks, deer tracks, wild hog sign, and the occasional river otter trail in his years of hunting Vinton County. He knows what belongs in that soil. He held his flashlight over that print for a long time, and what he told me was this: nothing that lives in Ohio leaves a track that looks like that. Nothing that lives anywhere he knows of is that large and built that way. And then he noticed Copper's flank. He found a burn mark on Copper's left side, circular, about the diameter of a $50, sitting in the fur without any of the surrounding hair being singed. The skin underneath was not broken. There was no blood, no discharge, no sign of infection. Webbed feet on a creature that weighs the better part of half a ton. A thermal burn with surgical precision. A tracking dog that chose a haunted tunnel over the open air. And somewhere on Route 56, the asphalt was still warm. I didn't know it yet, but by the time Tuesday morning arrived, 200 people were going to watch what happened next, live on a college student's phone, and then watch her disappear completely from the internet within 48 hours. Kira Vasquez was the kind of person who documented everything. Her followers knew her morning coffee, her class schedule, her opinions on the hiking trails around Ohio University's Athens campus. She'd done the Stroud's Run Trail on camera twice before. It was a Tuesday. She had a gap between classes. The fall color was still holding in the tree line, and she went live with 212 viewers watching from the start. For the first 9 minutes, the video is exactly what it looks like. A college student walking a well-maintained trail. At the 9-minute and 40-second mark, Kira stops walking. The camera, which she's been holding loosely at chest height, stops moving with her. There's a pause of about 4 seconds where she says nothing. Then, in a voice that is notably quieter than anything she'd said in the preceding 9 minutes, she says, "It's not a bear." Then she runs. The footage during the run is shaky and difficult to parse. But at the 6-second mark of the run, the camera swings left for just over 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, in the gap between two mature oak trees at the edge of the trail, Bigfoot is visible. I've paused on that frame more times than I can count. The two oaks are approximately 14 inches apart at the gap where the shape appears. 14 inches, which I confirmed by visiting the trail myself and measuring the scar the roots leave on the trail's edge. 14 inches is not a passage. It's a gap you turn sideways to squeeze through if you're a slender adult. What moves through it in Kira's footage is not slender. The Sasquatch that crosses between those trees is massive and dark, with a width across the shoulders that the frame, even in its shaky motion, cannot contain. Bigfoot did not push the trees apart. That's the part that the online analysis kept returning to, and it's the part that I can't explain away, no matter how I try. Both oaks are visible in the frame before and after the shape passes. Neither one moves, and neither trunk deflects. I reached out to Kira through a mutual contact at Ohio University. I'm not going to share the details of that conversation out of respect for where she is now, but I will tell you what she confirmed. She saw Bigfoot from a distance of roughly 40 feet before she started running. She described it as standing completely still between the trees, facing her direction. She said the stillness was the worst part. Not movement, not aggression, just absolute stillness. She withdrew from Ohio University 11 days after the sighting, but Tuesday wasn't finished with Ohio yet, because that same night, 12 miles west in Hocking Hills, a family was lying in a tent listening to something circle them in the dark, and their weather radio was about to say something that none of them have been able to unhear. The Callahan family, Dennis, his wife Sandra, and their 2 teenage sons, had been camping at Hocking Hills for 3 days by the time Tuesday night arrived. They were experienced campers. Dennis told me they'd done that campsite 4 times in the past 6 years. So when something started circling the tent at 11:43 p.m., Dennis Callahan knew immediately that it did not belong. It wasn't footsteps. That was the first thing he said to me, and he repeated it twice, the way people repeat details they know sound wrong, but need you to understand are accurate. It wasn't footsteps. It was a rhythmic, hollow percussion, a heavy thump followed by a half-second silence, then another thump, coming from ground level and moving in a slow arc around the perimeter of their campsite. It circled them for 20 minutes. Nobody in the tent spoke. Sandra had her hand on Dennis's arm. The boys, both teenagers who had spent the previous 2 days acting aggressively unimpressed by nature, were completely silent. 20 minutes of that rhythmic thump moving around them in the dark, never accelerating, never breaking pattern, never stopping. And then the weather radio turned on. They hadn't touched it. It was a hand-crank emergency unit sitting on top of the gear bag at the foot of the tent, and it powered on by itself. Dennis reached for it instinctively and stopped with his hand an inch away, because underneath the static, woven into it, almost like the static itself was being shaped, was a sound that was almost a voice. He told Sandra to listen. She heard it too. Both boys heard it. It took them a moment to isolate it from the noise, and then it was impossible to unisolate. 3 words repeating: not wood, not wood, not wood. The cadence was human. The rhythm was human. The spacing between repetitions followed the natural pause pattern of spoken English in a way that randomized static simply does not produce. Something was using the radio's frequency to push 3 words into that campsite, on loop, for 47 seconds before the unit cut to silence. The thumping stopped at the same moment the radio went quiet. I've spent a long time with those 2 words, not wood, trying to understand what they're warning against, or describing, or declaring. Something that might be mistaken for wood, or compared to wood, announcing that the comparison is wrong. Whatever Bigfoot is made of, whatever moves through its body, the way blood moves through ours, it apparently felt strongly enough about the distinction to say so. Twice a second for 47 seconds into a dead radio in a dark gorge in southern Ohio. What nobody realized yet was that a game warden was already awake before sunrise the next morning, driving toward Wayne National Forest to answer a livestock call. And what he found in that clearing had no explanation that any wildlife manual has ever prepared anyone for. Todd Schaffer has been a game warden in southeastern Ohio for 19 years. Wednesday morning's call from a farmer on the eastern edge of Wayne National Forest was about to add something to that private inventory that Todd will carry for the rest of his life. 8 dead deer were arranged in a clearing approximately 200 yards inside the tree line from the farm's eastern fence. They were positioned in a rough circle, each carcass facing outward from the center. There was no blood, not a trace, no pooling beneath the bodies, no spatter on the surrounding vegetation, no staining on the ground. 8 deer with no external wounds and no blood. However, every neck was broken. All 8 snapped at the second cervical vertebra with a consistency that the state wildlife veterinarian who later examined the carcasses described as extraordinary. Whatever broke those necks did so with a precision that the vet, in 22 years of wildlife pathology, had never encountered in an animal attack. She told Todd it looked, mechanically, like a procedure. Then Todd found the shelter. It was built at the northern edge of the clearing, set back into the tree line just far enough that he'd missed it on his first 2 passes. A dome-shaped structure roughly 6 feet high and 8 feet across, constructed from living saplings that had been bent and woven together while still rooted in the ground. The weaving was the thing that stopped him. Every junction where 2 saplings crossed was secured in a knot that Todd photographed and later showed to a botanist at Ohio State, who identified the pattern as nothing in any indigenous or traditional construction method she could reference. The knots weren't just functional, they were symmetrical, each one a mirror of the UI, last tied with a consistency that implied either long practice or a cognitive relationship with structure that nobody has ever formally attributed to Bigfoot. In the center of the shelter, on bare ground that had been cleared of leaf litter down to the soil, river stones had been arranged in a spiral. Smooth, palm-sized stones that had no business being 200 yards inside a forest with no creek nearby, carried in individually from somewhere else. Todd counted 31 of them. The spiral, when he photographed it from above by climbing a nearby oak, pointed in a single direction. He checked his compass twice. It pointed magnetic north with a precision that, as I later confirmed by overlaying his photograph on a topographic map, aimed directly at a specific ridge system 40 miles away. A ridge that sits directly above the Nelson Kennedy ledges. I didn't know that on Wednesday. Todd didn't know that on Wednesday, but something did, and it left 31 stones pointing at it in the middle of a forest in Morgan County before the sun came up. The next day, a deaf hunter in Shawnee sat down in a blind before sunrise, and Bigfoot walked up and talked to him, and what it said is remarkable. Gerald Ashworth has been deaf since birth. He's been hunting Shawnee State Forest since he was 12 years old. He told me all of this through an interpreter. He'd been in the blind since 5 a.m. At 7:28, he felt the vibration through the wooden platform under his boots, a slow, rhythmic ground compression that his feet told him was heavy and bipedal, and closer than anything that heavy had any right to be without him having registered its approach. He turned. Bigfoot was standing 30 feet away, in the creek bottom, facing him directly. Gerald told me he had time to take in details before anything else happened, the way deaf hunters often process visual information faster and more completely than hearing hunters whose attention is split across multiple senses. Bigfoot stood, by his estimate, 7 feet tall, juvenile-sized relative to what the week's other witnesses had described, though Gerald had no way of knowing that then. The build was broad through the chest and shoulders, narrower at the hip, covered in dark reddish-brown hair that caught the early light differently than fur, and differently than hair, and differently than anything Gerald had a word for. The face, and Gerald paused here, his interpreter pausing with him, was not an animal's face. That was the phrase he used, and the phrase he came back to twice. Not an animal's face. Then Bigfoot raised its hands. Gerald Ashworth has been fluent in American Sign Language his entire life. His parents signed, his wife signs, he taught his children to sign before they could speak. His hands are his first language and his deepest literacy, and when Bigfoot lifted both hands in front of its body and began to move them, Gerald's brain did what it has done every day for 53 years. It read. The signs weren't standard ASL. The hand shapes were approximate, the movements rougher and larger than conventional signing, the grammar stripped down to pure essential meaning, the way a child signs before they learn syntax. But the intent was legible. 3 concepts delivered in sequence, unmistakable to a man who has spent half a century reading hands. Go, bad night, many come. Gerald came down from that blind faster than he has moved in 20 years. He drove directly to the Scioto County Sheriff's substation and reported what he'd seen and what he'd been told. The deputy on duty logged the report, and the sheriff, when he heard it secondhand, apparently found it funny enough to share with the rest of the morning shift. Gerald sat across from that deputy's skepticism without flinching, because Gerald Ashworth did not need anyone to validate what his own hands had recognized. He asked the deputy to walk out to the parking lot with him instead. The scratches were on the tailgate of Gerald's truck, which had been parked at the Shawnee trailhead since 5 a.m. 3 parallel lines, each roughly 18 inches long, running horizontally across the steel. Not surface scratches, the metal had been displaced, the steel pushed inward rather than scraped away, as though the force had originated from inside the tailgate and pressed outward. Gerald's truck is a late-model half-ton with a 16-gauge steel tailgate. The deputy pressed his thumb into the nearest groove and didn't say anything for a long moment. The scratch depth, Gerald told me, was roughly a 1/4 inch into solid steel. Whatever made them didn't scratch his truck. It signed it. The idea that Bigfoot communicated a warning to a deaf man in a modified version of a human language and then left a physical message on his property in a location Bigfoot hadn't physically been anywhere near. Many come. That's not a territorial display. That's information. That's one party transferring knowledge to another party across a language barrier with enough intentionality to simplify its own communication to what the other party could receive. That requires a model of another mind. That requires Bigfoot to have looked at Gerald Ashworth and understood something about him before the first sign was made. And many come, said on Thursday morning, when there had already been 5 sightings in 4 days, when the pattern was almost complete, when whatever was moving through southeastern Ohio was apparently close enough to finished that a juvenile was sent to deliver the message. That phrase has not stopped ringing since Gerald's interpreter first spoke it aloud in that kitchen. Because the next morning at Burr Oak Reservoir, 2 fishermen were going to watch not just one, but an entire family of cryptids. Footage has never been this clear before. Pete Garrison and his brother-in-law, Carl Doost, had been on the water since before first light. They were anchored in the northern channel, roughly 300 yards from the eastern bank, when the tree line moved. Pete told me that's how it registered first, not as figures emerging from the forest, but as the tree line itself shifting. Then they were visible, and Pete reached over and put his hand on Carl's arm without saying a word, and Carl had already seen them. 5 Bigfoot walked out of the tree line and into Burr Oak Lake. 3 adults and 2 juveniles, moving in a loose group with the unhurried, purposeful stride that every witness this week had described in some form. Not cautious, not reactive, not behaving like creatures that expected to be observed or cared about being observed. The two juveniles were positioned between the adults, flanked on both sides. The largest adult, leading from the front, was Pete's estimate of 10 feet tall. They didn't swim. That's the detail that Carl kept returning to when I spoke with him separately, and that Pete had already told me, and that both men described in identical terms without having compared notes before I called them. Bigfoot did not swim. The adults waded in to chest depth and then continued walking as the water rose over their heads, and they did not resurface. The juveniles went under at shoulder depth. The surface of the lake closed over the last of them, one of the smaller juveniles, Carl thought, and went still. No bubbles, no displacement wake, no sign that 5 massive creatures had just submerged into a reservoir, with a maximum depth in that channel of 60 feet. Pete told me they sat in that boat for a long time without speaking. What neither Pete nor Carl knew, anchored in the northern channel watching the water, was that a state geological survey vessel had been working Burr Oak that same morning. The crew was conducting routine lakebed sonar mapping, the kind of survey that updates sediment charts and identifies erosion patterns in reservoir floors. They were running the eastern channel when their equipment registered something that the survey team lead, a man I'll call David because he asked me not to use his name, described to me as the most anomalous reading of his 12-year career. The sonar return showed a structure beneath the lakebed sediment, not geological formation. Structure. Rectangular, 60 feet in length, with straight edges and right angles that sediment does not produce and erosion does not carve. The walls of the shape, where the sonar could resolve them, registered at consistent thickness, like constructed material rather than compressed earth. David told me the readout was, in his exact words, consistent with a collapsed structure of artificial origin. They weren't wading into a lake, they were going home. But the home wasn't empty, and what a geology student from Kent State was about to find at the Nelson Kennedy Ledges that same Friday night is the reason This Week in Ohio stopped being a collection of strange sightings and became far more shocking. Dana Reeves spent the entire week reading, watching the Ohio sighting reports accumulate across forums and local Facebook groups. She's a second-year geology graduate student with a focus on subsurface magnetic anomalies, which means she reads landscapes the way other people read text. She told me that by Thursday night, after the game warden's spiral and the sonar anomaly started circulating in the groups she followed, something in her shifted from curiosity to certainty. She pulled up a county map, plotted all 7 reported locations, and saw what nobody else had publicly identified. Every sighting formed a perfect circle. 7 points, 7 counties, 7 incidents spread across 5 days. And when Dana drew the boundary they described, the center of that circle landed on the Nelson Kennedy Ledges with a precision that she told me made her physically cold when she saw it. The ledges sit on one of the highest magnetite concentrations in northeastern Ohio. She drove there alone. I want to be honest that when she told me this, my first reaction was that it was the wrong decision, and I told her so. She told me she knew it was the wrong decision when she made it, and went anyway, because she had a portable ground-penetrating radar unit in her trunk and a hypothesis that was going to eat her alive until she either proved or disproved it. She arrived at the ledges at 11:19 p.m., parked on the access road, and walked in with her radar. She didn't see Bigfoot. However, she saw the space where Bigfoot should have been. It was the heat shimmer, the same visual distortion Marcus Tilley had described from Route 56 on Monday morning, the same rippling displacement of air that looks like midsummer heat rising off hot pavement. But this was not a brief crossing. This was a vertical column of it, stationary, 10 feet tall, positioned at the center of the main ledge formation and stable enough that Dana walked a full circle around it. The radar was not detecting a creature. It was detecting a seam, a vertical fracture in the bedrock running straight down from the surface, narrow at the top and opening at roughly 200 feet into a lateral cavity that the radar's depth return put at stadium scale. The cavern ceiling, where the radar could resolve it, was 400 feet below where Dana was standing, and moving through that cavern, registering on the GPR as the same heat shimmer displacement signature that had shown up on every piece of recording equipment touched by this week's events, were shapes, dozens of them, some registering at the size the adult witnesses had described, some smaller, some registering at dimensions that the radar's scale bar, when Dana showed me the saved readout on her laptop, suggested were larger than anything reported above ground all week. They were all moving in the same direction, slowly, without urgency, in what the readout's density suggested was an organized group. And they were not moving toward the surface. They were assembling. So after all that, 8 sightings in 5 crazy days, here's what the last one finally showed us. And I'm not going to bury it in fancy words. See, each weird little clue from Monday through Friday morning was like a single puzzle piece. The truckers melting asphalt, the coonhound's webbed footprint and burn mark, the live stream where a 600-pound thing slipped through a 1-foot gap, the radio that kept saying not wood, the deaf hunter getting signed a warning, the deer with the perfectly snapped necks and that strange spiral of rocks pointing north, and the fisherman watching Bigfoot walk underwater towards something buried in the lake. None of it made sense alone. But the grad student at Nelson Kennedy Ledges, she saw the map. Every single sighting was circling that one spot. And when she turned on her ground radar, she didn't find a monster. She found a doorway, a crack in the bedrock that drops 400 feet down into a cavern the size of a football stadium. And inside that cavern, dozens of those heat shimmer shapes, just waiting. So here's the plain truth. Those things aren't wandering around Ohio by accident. The webbed feet and the underwater walking, that's how they use flooded tunnels to move between caves. The radio voice and the sign language, they've been listening to us long enough to mimic us. And that not wood whisper meant they're not made of regular flesh and bone. The asphalt ripples and the heat shimmer, they get hot when they cross into our world. The tree gap and the scratches inside the metal, they can make themselves thin, almost like they don't fully obey solid stuff. And the deer with the broken necks and the spiral stones, that wasn't hunting. That was marking territory. I think it's a compass pointing north, toward their front door. But here's the part that changes everything. What everybody saw wasn't an attack. It was a head count. They weren't hiding. They weren't hunting. You know what I think? I think they were taking a census, counting cars, campers, hikers, houses, all week long. And now they know exactly how many of us live inside their circle. The question isn't, are they real anymore? The question is, what do they do with that number?